This time on Classic Motorcycle A to Z, it's the letter N. So I'm going to be spending the next couple of months on a major adventure. This doesn't mean we're going to leave you without content though. We're putting together a series of videos which we're calling Classic Motorcycle A to Z. So basically we're going to run through the alphabet and give some history and information about various classic motorcycle companies as we go. New Imperial was founded by Norman Downs in Birmingham in 1887 and became New Imperial Motors in 1912. And in their first year they would enter the TT, but would alas fail to finish. But they shouldn't have felt too bad because actually 63 of the competitors also failed to finish, with only 24 competitors completing the course. In 1914 they introduced their lightweight model. This had a 300cc engine, but was so light that it actually could perform almost as well as an equivalent 500. And this machine, in common with many of their early bikes, used precision or JA Prestwick engines of 250 to 1000 cc's, although from 1925 onwards the company would produce its own motors from 150 to 500 cc's. And in 1921, after a number of DNFs, they would finally win their first TT race in the 250 class, their first of 6 victories all in the same category. And indeed by the mid-20s, New Imperial was doing quite well, for a relatively small company that is, only producing around 300 machines a month. In 1929, the small company moved to a purpose-built factory in Hall Green. The timing of the move was somewhat unfortunate, given that it coincided with the start of the Great Depression. In 1932, the company would introduce their first unit construction motorcycles, ranging from 150, later 250 and larger machines. And given the era, this does seem very smart. A unit construction engine, after all, is cheaper to manufacture than a non-unit one. And indeed by 1938, New Imperial's entire engine range was of unit construction, years ahead of most other British manufacturers following suit. Although strangely to us today, many buyers at the time were rather conservative and actually put off by the newfangled unit construction engines. Although the validity of the design was proven when Bob Foster won the 1936 lightweight 2T handsomely on a unit construction design 250. But despite this, greater sales simply did not materialise. But worse was to come, because in 1938 Norman Downs, founder of the company, would die, and the company would be sent into liquidation. Jack Sangster of Ariel and Triumph fame would step in and purchase the company at the end of December, and indeed as promised production would resume in January 1939. And indeed production would continue despite another change of hands, but would cease at the outbreak of World War II, never to start again. Birmingham-based Norton Motorcycles was founded by James Lansdowne Norton in 1898, and initially the company would use power units imported from the continent, including the Peugeot V-twin which powered around Fowler to Norton's first TT win in 1907. But 1907 was also the year that Norton began development of its first in-house power units, which were single-cylinder side-valve engines of 490cc and the Big 4, which was of a whopping 633cc. An engine which bizarrely remained in production with Norton, with few modifications, through until the 1950s. Initially the company struggled, but soon began to realise the value of competition for promoting their machines. And indeed one such machine, tuned by Dan O'Donovan, would set 6 world speed records in 1914. After the First World War, Norton would continue its racing activities, with the 1924 Senior TT win by Alec Bennett being the first to have an average speed of over 60 miles an hour, and the first to use a Norton overhead valve engine. But as today, racing moves on very quickly. So in 1927, their designer Walter Moore would design the CS1, Norton's first overhead cam racer. However, in 1930, Moore would leave Norton and join NSU, for whom he would design a similar single-cylinder overhead cam unit which looked very similar to the Nortons. In response, Norton's Arthur Carroll would design a completely new overhead cam engine, which would form the basis of all Norton's racing singles thereafter, including the post-war dual overhead cam models. And during the 1930s, Norton would be the team to beat at the TT, with 7 TT victories between 1931 and 1939. And on their road bikes, Norton would produce a race replica, the International, which was a development of the earlier Walter Moore engine, and was an expensive sporting machine. which would have a surprisingly long production run, lasting right into the 1950s when the final models were equipped with a mechanless featherbed frame. But Norton would also follow the herd, and post-World War II would introduce a 500cc parallel twin, which would evolve into the sporting Dominator series, which like the singles would be fitted with a featherbed frame in the 1950s, to create the Dominator 88. This would latterly be enlarged to 600cc for the Dominator 99, and still further for the 650SS in the early 60s. But by that time the company had already been purchased by Associated Motorcycles, and when AMC hit financial troubles at the beginning of the 60s, the planned move of Norton to a new factory was cancelled and production was instead moved to Plumstead. But it wasn't all bad news, because Norton could now use the AMC gearbox, and while this much later would prove unreliable in the Norton races of the 1970s, in normal road applications it was a vast improvement over the earlier Norton unit. And another improvement was the introduction of the slimline frame in 1960. This road developed version of the chassis was, as the name suggests, narrow at the top to improve rider comfort. And for the US market in 1962 would come the 750 Atlas. But whilst powerful, the Atlas was vibratory above 5000 RPM. And to cure this, Norton would develop the Commando. This was essentially an Atlas engine mounted into a frame which isolated the engine, transmission and rear suspension away from the rider on rubber mounts, and would prove so effective that the Commando would remain in production between 1967 and 1975. Like the French company Terreau, NSU originated as a manufacturer of knitting machines in 1873, and by 1901 the company had made its first motorcycle, with its first car following in 1905. In 1930 the company was joined by Walter Moore. Now Walter had previously worked at Norton and had designed the overhead cam racing engine, and would go on to design a near identical unit for NSU, causing the jibe, NSU means Norton Spares Used. During the war as part of Auto Union, NSU would of course build dispatch rider motorcycles, but there would also be the Kettengrad. This was a bizarre half-track, with a motorcycle front end and a Caterpillar rear end powered by a 4-cylinder Opel car engine. NSU's first post-war motorcycle was the Fox, which was introduced in 1949 and was available with both 2-stroke and 4-stroke power units. Further up the range came the 250 Max. This groundbreaking machine made use of a pressed steel monocoque chassis and featured a single-cylinder overhead cam 4-stroke engine, which made use of a system of con rods to power its camshaft, instead of a more traditional chain or bevel drive. And while it sounds unusual, the system was effective, with NSU finding success in Grand Prix racing. But there's no doubt that the most famous NSU of them all is the most humble. The NSU quickly was a 50cc step-through moped first introduced in the early 50s. There was a simple 50cc 2-stroke engine, leg shields, and a pressed steel monocoque frame. And the machine was a massive seller for NSU and would provide inspiration for Honda's Super Cub. But by the 1960s the company wanted to focus on car production and turned its back on motorcycles at the end of the 60s. N.U.T stands for Newcastle upon Tyne, so there's no prizes for guessing where these motorcycles were manufactured. The company was founded in 1912 by Hugh Mason and Jock Hall, and by 1913 the company was competing successfully at the Isle of Man TT races, with a win for Hugh Mason on a jet-powered machine in the 1913 Junior TT. Initially the company used Jap and Villiers power units, but would later produce their own sports V-twin engines. But unfortunately the company was declared bankrupt during the First World War, but was brought back from the dead by one Robert Ellis in 1921, and despite floundering again in 1922, production of the machines would continue, but being a small company were badly affected by the Great Depression and would close their doors for good in 1933. Norman Motorcycles, or Bicycles as it was originally, was founded in Ashford in Kent by brothers Charles and Fred Norman. Building its first autocycle in 1938, the company is best known for its smaller machines such as the Norman Nippy, which would make use of a Sachs 50cc 2-stroke engine. They would also use engines from Villiers and British Anzani, with the vast majority being in the sub 200cc category, although there would be a more sporting model, as you can see here, fitted with Villiers 2T units. The Ashford factory would close in 1961, although production would continue elsewhere for a short period. Whatever bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see featured in a future video? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride? Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.